What compels a 16th-century woman to forsake the comforts of nobility and embrace a life of poverty, prayer, and radical reform? The answer lies within the extraordinary life of Saint Teresa of Ávila. Born Teresa de Cepeda y Ahumada in Avila, Spain, on March 28, 1515, this remarkable woman not only transformed the Carmelite order, but also left a spiritual legacy that continues to illuminate souls thirsting for God to this very day. Her life, marked by mystical ecstasy, the founding of convents, and a reform that reshaped religious life, invites us to discover how divine grace can work wonders in a heart completely surrendered to the Lord. Chapter 1. Teresa's early years. In the noble estate of the Cepeda and Ahumada family, nestled in the distinguished city of Avila, a girl was born, destined to become one of the brightest figures in Catholic spirituality. Teresa entered the world into a deeply Christian household, the daughter of Mr. Alan Sanchez, a prosperous and devout merchant, and Mrs. Beatrice d'Avila, a woman of great virtue, who passed away when Teresa was only 14 years old. The family home resonated with an atmosphere of authentic faith, where prayer and the reading of saints' lives formed the daily nourishment of the spirit. From a very young age, Teresa displayed a fervent and generous nature, drawing her toward the things of God. When she was barely 7 years old, alongside her brother Rodrigo, she conceived a daring plan to journey to the Moorish lands, to shed their blood for Christ, and thus attain the crown of martyrdom. The two children set off, but were intercepted by their uncle after they had already crossed the Adaja Bridge. This episode, recounted with grace by the saint herself in her autobiography, reveals the intensity of her childhood soul and her early desire for total surrender to the Lord. The reading of chivalry books, so popular at the time, also exerted a powerful influence on the impressionable mind of young Teresa. These tales of adventure and courtly love ignited in her a vivid imagination and a taste for the extraordinary, which, although initially diverting her from evangelical simplicity, would later transform into fuel for her mystical fervor. Divine providence knows how to use even youthful diversions to prepare souls destined for great supernatural endeavors. The death of her mother, when Teresa was 14, profoundly marked her adolescent heart. Overcome with inconsolable grief, she threw herself at the feet of an image of the Blessed Virgin Mary and begged her to be her mother from then on. This moment of maternal grace would forever define Teresa's devotion to the Mother of God, who would become a constant guide on her spiritual path. The Virgin Mary, as a true mother, accepted this filial plea and accompanied Teresa in all the decisive moments of her life. During her adolescence, Teresa experienced the natural anxieties of her age, being sent by her father to the convent of St. Augustine of Our Lady of Grace to complete her education. There, under the wise guidance of the nuns, especially Sister Mary of Briceño, she began to experience the first stirrings of a religious vocation that she did not yet dare to fully acknowledge. The spiritual conversations with this novice mistress and the observation of convent life were sowing in her heart the first seeds of what would become her glorious religious destiny. Chapter 2. The Awakening of a Vocation. Teresa's vocational discernment was not an easy process, nor was it free from inner struggles. During her time at the convent of St. Augustine, the young woman experienced a strange division in her soul. On the one hand, she felt a growing attraction to religious life, but on the other, her natural love for her father and the comforts of the world held her back strongly. This inner tension, so common in souls called to perfection, lasted for months, being an occasion of great merit in the eyes of God, who allows these trials to purify the intentions of his chosen ones. The reading of the epistles of Saint Jerome was providential at this time in her life. The fervent words of the holy doctor about the excellence of a life consecrated to God were like a light that dispelled the darkness of her indecision. Teresa then understood that the religious state was the safest for the salvation of the soul and the one that best responded to the deep longings of her heart. However, this intellectual certainty did not immediately calm the resistances of her nature, especially the pain caused by the prospect of separating from her beloved father. On November 2nd, 1535, Teresa made the most important decision of her life. She secretly left her father's house to enter the convent of the Incarnation of Ávila. This Carmelite monastery, which housed more than 150 nuns, was governed by a mitigated observance, which, although less austere than the original rule of Carmel, offered a favorable environment for the development of spiritual life. The departure was painful for both her and her father, who initially opposed his daughter's decision, but who finally, recognizing the divine will, granted his paternal blessing. The ceremony of taking the habit, celebrated on November 2nd, 1535, officially marked the beginning of Teresa's religious life, clothed in the holy habit of Carmel. The young postulant experienced immense inner joy, which she herself described as superior to any worldly satisfaction she had ever known. This spiritual joy was a divine confirmation of the rectitude of her choice and a foretaste of the extraordinary graces that God had prepared for her generous soul. The year of novitiate passed in a climate of fervor and remarkable spiritual progress. Teresa gave herself wholeheartedly to the practice of religious virtues, especially obedience, poverty, and chastity, discovering in each of them a privileged path to union with God. Prayer, which would become the central axis of her life and her teaching, began to flourish in her heart like a spring of living water that would never again run dry. Her novice mistress and the more experienced sisters recognized in her the unmistakable signs of an authentic vocation and of a soul destined for great things in divine service. Chapter 3. The Years of Spiritual Dryness. After taking her religious vows on November 3rd, 1537, Teresa began a period of her life that she herself would later call the lost years. This stage, stretching for nearly 2 decades, was marked by a serious illness that kept her bedridden for long months, and what was even more painful for her soul, by a gradual lukewarmness in her spiritual life, which distanced her from the consistent practice of mental prayer. However, divine providence had its own designs regarding this apparent barrenness, secretly preparing the soul of its future mystic for the great graces it would bestow upon her. The illness that afflicted Saint Teresa of Ávila shortly after her religious profession was so severe that she was brought to the brink of death. The doctors of the time, with their limited knowledge, applied treatments that only worsened her condition, to the point that for several days they considered her dead, even going so far as to prepare her burial. During this trance, Teresa experienced a vision of hell that would mark her deeply. But she also received the assurance of her healing through the intercession of Saint Joseph, toward whom she professed a special devotion from then on, a devotion she would transmit to the entire Reformed order as she gradually recovered her health. Teresa found herself with a soul spiritually weakened by suffering and past tribulations. Mental prayer, which had once been her delight, became a heavy burden due to the distractions and dryness she experienced. Influenced by confessors with little experience in the ways of the Spirit, she made the unfortunate decision to abandon the practice of prayer, retaining only the recitation of the divine office and other vocal devotions. This abandonment of mental prayer was, in her own words, the greatest misfortune of her life. During these years of apparent spiritual barrenness, Teresa let herself be carried away by the relaxed customs of the convent of the Incarnation of Ávila, where the nuns received frequent visits and maintained friendships that, without being sinful, distracted the heart from the exclusive search for God. The saint cultivated some of these friendships with excessive indulgence, finding in them a human comfort that somehow filled the void left by the abandonment of divine intimacy. However, her delicate conscience kept her in a state of constant unease, as she sensed that she was not fully responding to the graces she had received. Despite this situation of spiritual mediocrity, God did not abandon his servant, but allowed her, in the most unexpected moments, to feel in her soul inner calls, inviting her to resume the path of perfection. These divine promptings, although not always followed with due faithfulness, kept alive in her heart the flame of God's love, and prepared the ground for the great conversion that would definitively transform her life. Divine providence knows how to draw good from evil, and even use human infidelities as pedagogy to teach souls the absolute necessity of his grace and the importance of humility on the spiritual path. Through 20 years of spiritual dryness, Teresa discovered profound secrets that transformed her relationship with God. These 7 spiritual keys opened heaven's graces and led to extraordinary miracles in her life and ministry. If Teresa's journey of faith has touched your heart, discover how her mystical practices can unlock the miraculous in your own spiritual path. The 7 Secret Keys of Saint Teresa to Achieve Miracles is available in the first pinned comment and QR code on your screen, but only for a limited time. Chapter 4. The Definitive Conversion. The year 1554 marked a decisive turning point in Teresa's spiritual life. She was then 39 years old and had spent nearly 2 decades living in a religious mediocrity, which, without being properly sinful, kept her away from the heights to which God destined her. The instrument that divine providence chose for her definitive conversion was an image of Christ, very wounded, that had been placed in a room of the convent on the occasion of a certain festivity. Upon contemplating that representation of the suffering Savior, Teresa felt her heart break with pain and compunction for having responded so poorly to the infinite love of the one who had suffered so much for her. In that moment of extraordinary grace, Teresa threw herself at the foot of the crucifix, bathed in tears, and begged the Lord to give her strength not to offend him anymore. This prayer, born from the depths of her contrite soul, was heard by the merciful heart of Christ, who from then on began to shower her with abundant graces of conversion and sanctification. The saint always considered this moment as the true beginning of her spiritual life, for it was then that she recovered with renewed fervor the practice of mental prayer, which she had abandoned for so many years. Reading the Confessions by St. Augustine was another determining factor in her conversion process. Upon reading the account of the transformation of the great African doctor, Teresa felt deeply identified with his inner struggles and found in him a model of soul who, after having lived far from God, had known how to give himself totally to his service. The episode of St. Augustine's conversion in the garden, upon hearing the voice of the child who told him, "Take and read," resonated in a particular way in Teresa's heart, who saw in it a divine invitation to follow the same path of total surrender. Parallel to this inner conversion, Teresa began to experience the first manifestations of mystical life that would characterize the rest of her days. The raptures and ecstasies, initially sporadic, became more frequent, filling her soul with an indescribable peace and joy that contrasted sharply with the aridity of previous years. These extraordinary graces, far from making her proud, humbled her deeply, for she recognized in them the pure divine mercy towards a soul that had not deserved them at all. However, these mystical favors brought with them new tribulations, for not all confessors and spiritual directors were prepared to understand and direct a soul favored with such graces. Some reassured her that they came from God, while others frightened her, suggesting that they could be diabolical illusions. This uncertainty caused Teresa great inner suffering, but it also led her to develop an extraordinary spiritual discernment, which she would later express in her works, especially in The Interior Castle, where she masterfully describes the various degrees of mystical life and the criteria for distinguishing true visions from false ones. Before we continue with Saint Teresa's profound mystical journey, we ask for a special favor. If this story has nourished your faith and inspired you to live your Christian vocation with greater authenticity, we invite you to pray a Hail Mary for our work and evangelization mission. And if you wish to support us, you can do so through the Super Thanks button here on YouTube. Your prayer and generosity allow us to continue sharing these stories of holiness that our world so desperately needs. May Saint Teresa of Ávila intercede for you, and may the Blessed Virgin Mary bless you. Let us now continue discovering the extraordinary conversion that would transform Teresa's life forever. Chapter 5. The Mystical Gifts. From her definitive conversion onward, Teresa began to experience a progressive escalation of mystical graces that made her one of the most extraordinary figures in the history of Catholic spirituality. The ecstasies, which at first surprised her at unexpected moments, became increasingly frequent and intense, elevating her soul to heavenly regions, where she enjoyed an intimate and transforming union with God. These raptures, which could last for hours, left her with an experimental understanding of divine love that no book could have ever taught her, and with a burning desire to suffer for Christ that completely transformed her perspective on suffering. Visions were another remarkable aspect of St. Teresa's mystical life. Teresa carefully distinguished between corporeal visions, which she perceived with her physical eyes, imaginary visions, which appeared in her fantasy with greater clarity than real images, and intellectual visions, which were perceived directly by the soul without the mediation of senses or images. Among all of these, the most significant was the vision of the resurrected Lord, who appeared to her while she was in prayer, showing her his glorified hands and speaking to her with words that were forever etched in her memory. "Do not be afraid, my child, for I am here, I will not abandon you." The most extraordinary mystical experience of all was the transverberation of her heart, which Saint Teresa recounts with impressive detail in her autobiography. She saw a beautiful angel beside her, carrying a golden dart with a flaming tip, with which he pierced her heart several times, leaving her completely consumed with divine love. This mystical favor, immortalized by the artistic genius of Bernini, symbolizes the pinnacle of transforming union, where the soul is totally united with God in a love that is simultaneously pain and joy, death and life, martyrdom and glory. Inner locutions constantly accompanied Saint Teresa's mystical life. She learned to distinguish with extraordinary precision when these words came from God, when from her own imagination, and when from the devil. True, divine locutions were characterized by their clarity, their transformative efficacy, and the fruits of peace and humility that they produced in her soul. These celestial communications guided her during the most important moments of her life, especially in the undertaking of the Carmelite reform, confirming that this work was desired by God and that He Himself would assist her in all difficulties. Despite enjoying these extraordinary graces, Saint Teresa always maintained an attitude of profound humility and self-distrust, constantly submitting her experiences to the judgment of learned theologians and experienced spiritual directors. This docility toward ecclesiastical authority, combined with her constant fear of being deceived by the devil, preserved her from the errors into which less prudent souls often fall when receiving mystical favors. She knew that these graces did not make her better than other souls, but that they were free gifts from God intended not only for her own sanctification, but also for the good of the entire Church, especially through the founding of Reformed convents, where prayer would be lived in all its purity. Chapter 6. The Reform of the Carmelites. The idea of founding a convent, where the primitive rule of the Carmelites would be observed in all its purity, was born in St. Teresa's heart during one of her ecstasies, when the Lord clearly manifested his will that she undertake this reforming work. The vision of the state of laxity in which the Carmelite order found itself, combined with her burning love for Christ and for souls, ignited in her an apostolic zeal that impelled her to dedicate the rest of her life to this gigantic undertaking. However, the realization of this divine project would encounter enormous obstacles, both in the secular world and in the religious sphere itself. The first foundation, which would be named St. Joseph of Ávila, was conceived in the utmost secrecy, due to the opposition that St. Teresa anticipated encountering both in her own convent of the Incarnation and in the civil and ecclesiastical authorities of the city, relying solely on the help of a few generous souls, especially her sister Jenny d'Avila and her brother-in-law Jacob Val. St. Teresa began to discreetly prepare everything necessary for this foundation, which would be the prototype of the Carmelite reform. The secret conversations, the search for financial resources, and the spiritual preparation of the future nuns unfolded for months amid constant tension and multiple practical difficulties. When St. Teresa's intention was finally made public, a true storm of opposition erupted in Avila. The city council spoke out against it, fearing that a new mendicant convent would represent an additional burden on the city's economy. The nuns of the Incarnation felt offended, interpreting the foundation as an implicit criticism of their way of life. Even some confessors and devout people who until then had supported St. Teresa began to doubt the advisability of the undertaking, suggesting that it could be a diabolical illusion or an impulse of spiritual pride. Despite all these adversities, St. Teresa persevered in her purpose with heroic constancy, sustained solely by the inner certainty that this work proceeded from God. On August 24th, 1562, the feast of St. Bartholomew, the first Mass was celebrated in the new convent of St. Joseph, officially marking the birth of the Carmelite reform. The 4 novices who received the habit in that inaugural ceremony thus became the first Discalced Carmelites, committing themselves to living the primitive rule of the Carmelites with all its rigor, including papal enclosure, absolute poverty without fixed incomes, and the practice of mental prayer for several hours daily. The first years of life in St. Joseph were a true spiritual paradise for St. Teresa and her daughters. Evangelical poverty, far from constituting a deprivation, became a source of joy and confidence in divine providence. Prayer flourished in that atmosphere of silence and recollection as it had never flourished in the mitigated convents, and the nuns experienced a peace and inner satisfaction that abundantly compensated for all external austerities. St. Teresa was thus able to verify that her intuitions about the necessity of the reform were correct, and that God abundantly blessed those who dared to follow more closely in the footsteps of Christ, poor and crucified. Chapter 7. The Foundations throughout Spain. The spiritual success of the convent of St. Joseph of Ávila awakened in St. Teresa the burning desire to extend the reform to other cities in Spain, thus multiplying the centers of intense prayer that the Church so desperately needed in those times of religious crisis. At 52 years old, when most nuns of her time were seeking rest and tranquility, St. Teresa embarked on a foundational journey that would lead her through the dusty roads of Castile for 15 years, establishing 17 convents for nuns and collaborating on the founding of just as many for Discalced Carmelite friars. The second founding took place in Medina del Campo in 1567, a prosperous commercial city where Teresa hoped to find greater economic ease and less opposition than in Avila. However, the journey there, made in ox carts on impassable roads, gave her a first taste of the physical hardships she would endure during her years as an itinerant founder. The nocturnal arrival in Medina, the search for a suitable house in an unknown city, and the first nights spent in precarious conditions were the prelude to innumerable similar discomforts that Teresa would always accept with joy, seeing in them a participation in the poverty of Christ, the pilgrim. Each new foundation presented specific difficulties that required Teresa to constantly adapt and to have a heroic trust in divine providence. In Malagon, she encountered opposition from some noble families who saw the new convent as competition to their traditional foundations. In Valladolid, she had to face health problems that endangered the health of the nuns. In Toledo, she experienced the greatest economic hardships, reaching the point of having nothing to eat for several days. But there too, she witnessed the most admirable providences of God, who never allowed her daughters to lack what was necessary. The trips between one foundation and another became true apostolic expeditions, where Teresa took advantage of every moment to do good to souls. In the inns where she stayed, she engaged in spiritual conversations with other travelers, sowing in their hearts the seeds of devotion and the love of God. The priests she met on the road received advice from her on the inner life and the importance of prayer, thus contributing indirectly to the reform of the clergy that the church of her time so desperately needed. In this way, Teresa's foundational activity transcended the limits of her own order to become an apostolate of much wider scope. The correspondence that Teresa maintained during these years with the prioresses of her convents constitutes one of the most precious treasures of Catholic spiritual literature. In these letters, often dictated during her travels or written late at night after exhausting days, the maternal heart of the saint is revealed, constantly worried about the spiritual and material well-being of her daughters. Each convent was for her like a beloved child, and each nun occupied a particular place in her praying heart. This correspondence also shows Teresa's extraordinary organizational capacity, who, from a distance, knew how to direct with precision all aspects of convent life, from the highest questions of spirituality to the most practical details of domestic administration. Chapter 8. Collaboration with St. John of the Cross. One of the most remarkable graces that God granted to St. Teresa in her reforming work was the meeting with St. John of the Cross, the young Carmelite friar who would become her main collaborator to extend the reform to the male branch of the order. This providential meeting took place in Medina del Campo in 1567. When Johnny Rivers was still a student at the University of Salamanca, contemplating the possibility of entering the Carthusian order, attracted by the contemplative life of those monks, Teresa immediately recognized in that 25-year-old young man the instrument that God had prepared to carry out an undertaking that was beyond her feminine strengths. The conversations between the two saints revealed an extraordinary spiritual affinity that transcended the differences in age, training, and temperament. Teresa, a woman of indefatigable action, found in St. John of the Cross the contemplative soul that could give the male reform the mystical depth she desired. For his part, Johnny found in Teresa the experienced guide who had already traveled the highest paths of union with God and could transmit to him, along with the reforming ideals, the practical wisdom necessary to carry them out. This complementarity of charisms was one of the most beautiful phenomena in the history of Carmelite spirituality. The first foundation of Discalced Carmelite friars was established in Duruelo, a small village lost in the Castilian fields, where St. John of the Cross, accompanied by Friar Anthony of Jesus, began to live the primitive rule of Carmel with a rigor that astonished even Teresa. The poverty of that first house was so extreme that the saint could not hold back her tears when visiting it, but at the same time, she experienced an indescribable joy in verifying the fervor with which those first Discalced Carmelites embraced the austerities of the hermitic life. There, the spirit of the male reform was gestated, characterized by the perfect synthesis between contemplation and apostolic action. However, this collaboration between the two great saints of Carmel was not without tribulations. The authorities of the Carmelite order, alarmed by the rapid growth of the reform, began to systematically persecute the Discalced friars, going to the extreme of imprisoning St. John of the Cross for 9 months in the convent of Toledo. During this period of trial, Teresa displayed an indefatigable activity to achieve the liberation of her collaborator, writing letters to the civil and ecclesiastical authorities and mobilizing all her influences in the court. The unwavering confidence she maintained during those dark months revealed the depth of her faith and her certainty that the reforming work, because it was wanted by God, would triumph over all human adversities. When the legal separation between the Calced and Discalced Carmelites was finally achieved, Teresa could contemplate with immense satisfaction how the male reform, under the direction of St. John of the Cross and other faithful collaborators, extended throughout Spain with the same vigor that had characterized the female foundations. The convents of Discalced friars became centers of intense contemplative life and focal points of apostolic irradiation that contributed effectively to the spiritual renewal that the Church needed after the Council of Trent. Teresa's prophetic vision of a completely renewed Carmelite family was thus realized beyond her most optimistic expectations. Chapter 9. Immortal Works. Parallel to her intense activity in founding new convents, Saint Teresa of Ávila developed a literary body of work that has established her as one of the most important figures in universal mystical literature. And as a doctor of the Church, her writings, born more from personal experience than theoretical speculation, possess a freshness and an authenticity that have made them an inexhaustible source of spiritual teaching. For all subsequent generations, the saint wrote under obedience to her confessors, frequently in very precarious conditions, taking advantage of the scarce free moments that her multiple occupations as founder and reformer allowed her, but always with the conviction that she was transmitting the teachings that she had received directly from the interior master. Her indisputable masterpiece is The Interior Castle, also known as The Mansions, written in 1577, during one of her stays in Toledo. In this extraordinary book, Teresa describes the soul as a diamond castle where the King of Glory dwells, developing an architectural allegory that allows one to understand, with clarity, the various degrees of spiritual life. The 7 mansions that make up this interior castle represent just as many stages on the path toward the transforming union with God, from the first hesitant steps of devout life to the highest peaks of spiritual marriage. The psychological precision with which she describes the phenomena of mystical life, united with the literary beauty of her expressions, has made this work a timeless classic of spiritual literature. The Book of My Life, her spiritual autobiography, constitutes another monument of mystical literature, where Saint Teresa of Ávila narrates, with admirable sincerity, the stages of her interior evolution, from the deviations of her youth to the extraordinary graces of her maturity. This work, written out of obedience, but with evident personal repugnance, due to her profound humility, has become a model for all who wish to know the interior paths of the soul towards God. In it, she masterfully expounds her famous doctrine of the 4 degrees of prayer, comparing them to the various ways of watering a garden, from the laborious work of drawing water from the well to the abundant rain that God sends without human effort. The way of perfection represents the saint's most practical work, written specifically for her nuns of St. Joseph as a manual of spiritual life. In this treatise, Teresa develops an accessible and concrete teaching on the fundamental virtues of religious life, especially detachment, humility, and brotherly love. The second part of the work contains a commentary on the Lord's Prayer, which constitutes one of the most beautiful and profound expositions of the dominical prayer in all of Christian literature. With her maternal and direct style, Teresa teaches her daughters how to transform vocal prayer into contemplation, showing that there is no contradiction between both forms of praying when they are practiced with a heart full of love. The Book of the Foundations completes the main corpus of St. Teresa of Avila's writings, narrating with extraordinary vivacity the vicissitudes and adventures of her founding activity. This work, which combines historical chronicle with spiritual teaching, reveals the complete personality of Teresa, the woman of action who does not allow herself to be defeated by difficulties, the mystic who reads in all events the providential hand of God, and the spiritual teacher who knows how to extract profound teachings from the most everyday experiences. The portraits that she draws of the people who collaborated in her foundations constitute a human gallery of extraordinary psychological and spiritual value. The letters of St. Teresa of Ávila, which number more than 400, form an epistolary collection of incalculable value, both for their spiritual content and for their historical and literary value. In them, the most intimate and spontaneous Teresa is revealed, the spiritual mother who guides her daughters with tenderness and firmness, the friend who shares the joys and sorrows of her correspondence, the woman of government who organizes with precision all aspects of conventual life. These letters have been justly called the best autobiography of St. Teresa of Ávila, because in them, her grand and generous soul is reflected without the reservations that humility imposed on her in her works intended for publication. Chapter 10, The Last Foundations and Persecutions. The last years of Teresa's life were marked by an intensification of the persecutions against the Carmelite reform, which reached their climax during the period known as the Storm. The authorities of the Carmelite order, supported by the pontifical nuncio, Philip Sears, unleashed a systematic campaign against the Discalced Carmelites, going to the extreme of prohibiting new foundations and threatening to dissolve those already existing. This situation caused Teresa indescribable suffering, not so much for the personal deprivations that it might bring her, but for seeing in danger a work that she knew proceeded directly from the divine will. The most painful accusation that was directed against Teresa during this period was that of being a restless and wandering woman who sowed discord in the order under the pretext of reform. These slanders, propagated even by people who had been her benefactors, deeply wounded the sensitive heart of the saint, but they did not manage to break her confidence in God, nor her determination to continue the work undertaken with admirable serenity. Teresa responded to her detractors that she preferred to be considered crazy rather than abandon an enterprise that had cost so much work, and that was giving such evident fruits of sanctification. Despite the official prohibitions, Teresa managed to carry out, during this period, some of her most cherished foundations, especially that of Burgos, which was to be the last of her life. The trip to this city in the north of Castile, undertaken in January of 1582, when the saint was already 67 years old, was particularly painful due to the harsh winter and to her increasingly delicate state of health. However, Teresa faced all these difficulties with the same cheerful and confident spirit that had characterized her first founding ventures, seeing in each obstacle a new opportunity to merit before God. The difficulties encountered in Burgos were greater than those of any other previous foundation. The opposition of the archbishop, the economic problems, the intrigues of various interest groups, and the hardships of accommodation combined to make that stay a true trial by fire. For several months, Teresa and her companions lived in conditions so precarious that the founder's health suffered greatly, but she persevered with heroic steadfastness until she saw the new community definitively established. This final founding was like Teresa's spiritual testament, the final demonstration that neither age nor illness could subdue a soul. Entirely dedicated to divine service, parallel to these external trials, Teresa experienced increasingly elevated mystical graces during her final years, preparing her for the ultimate encounter with her celestial bridegroom. Her ecstasies became more frequent and prolonged, and divine communications constantly reassured her about the future of the reform, assuring her that the work would survive all human persecutions. In one of her last visions, the Lord showed her the crown of glory prepared for her, confirming that her work on earth was nearing its end and that she would soon enjoy the eternal reward, reserved for faithful servants. Chapter 11. The Passage to Glory. Saint Teresa's final journey began on September 20th, 1582, when she departed from Burgos towards Alba de Tormes to attend the childbirth of the Duchess of Alba, who had been one of her main benefactors. Despite being seriously ill and experiencing great difficulty standing, Teresa agreed to perform this final act of charity, moved by her spirit of gratitude and obedience to her superiors. The journey, undertaken in very difficult conditions due to the autumn rains and the deplorable state of the roads, considerably aggravated her illness, but she generously offered it as a final offering to the Lord, who had loved her so much. Upon arriving in Alba de Tormes on September 20th, Teresa was already in a state of extreme weakness, which she could not conceal from the nuns who received her with joy. However, she retained her usual serenity and maternal concern for the spiritual well-being of her daughters. During the following days, she alternated periods of rest with moments of intense prayer, experiencing increasingly prolonged ecstasies in which her soul seemed to progressively detach itself from earthly bonds. The nuns assisting her noticed a special luminosity in her face, revealing the proximity of celestial glory. On October 3rd, the feast of Saint Francis of Assisi, Teresa experienced a sudden worsening, which made everyone understand that her final hour had arrived. She then asked to be taken to the choir, where she wanted to receive Holy Communion in the presence of the entire community, pronouncing words that were forever etched in the memory of those present. At last, I die a daughter of the Church. This declaration, made at a time when some questioned her orthodoxy, constituted the spiritual testament of a woman who had lived her entire life in perfect communion with the Apostolic See, and who wanted to seal her ecclesiastical fidelity at the supreme moment of her passing. After receiving the last sacraments with a devotion that deeply edified all those present, Teresa retired to her cell to prepare herself in silence for the ultimate encounter with her celestial bridegroom. The final hours of her life passed in admirable peace and serenity, interrupted only by brief conversations with the Lord, which the nuns overheard without fully understanding their meaning. At 9 o'clock on the night of October 4th, 1582, while repeating the words of the Magnificat, which she had loved so much during her life, Saint Teresa gently surrendered her soul to the Creator. Without agony or convulsions, like someone falling sweetly asleep in the arms of her beloved, Teresa's death coincided with the reform of the calendar, promulgated by Pope Gregory XIII, so that the day after her death, October 4th, directly became October 15th, according to the new reckoning. This detail, seemingly anecdotal, was interpreted by her spiritual daughters as a sign from heaven, indicating the exceptional nature of their mother founder. The saint's body, which emitted a celestial fragrance, was initially buried in Alba de Tormes, where it remained incorrupt for 9 months until its solemn transfer to Ávila. However, Teresa's mortal remains eventually returned to Alba, where they rest to this day, as an inexhaustible source of blessings for the countless pilgrims who come to honor her memory. Chapter 12. Prayer to Saint Teresa of Ávila. Glorious Saint Teresa of Ávila, seraphic virgin and mystical doctor of the Church, who knew how to unite in your admirable life the most elevated contemplation with the most fruitful action, come to our aid from the celestial glory, where you eternally enjoy the beatific vision of the most holy Trinity. You who experienced on earth the most sublime raptures and the most painful purifications, understand our spiritual struggles and obtain for us from God the grace to persevere on the path of Christian perfection. With the same heroic generosity that characterized your entire earthly existence, Saint Teresa, renowned teacher of the interior life, who taught so many souls the secrets of prayer and the degrees of mystical union with God, illuminate our understanding so that we may know how to distinguish in our spiritual experiences what proceeds from the Holy Spirit, from what are mere illusions of our self-love or temptations of the enemy of souls. Help us to cultivate mental prayer with perseverance, that intimate friendship with the one who we know loves us, and never to falter in this fundamental exercise, even if we experience dryness, distractions, or apparent sterility, which so afflict souls beginning on the paths of the Spirit, tireless reformer of Carmel, who renewed the religious life of your time, returning to the purest sources of evangelical spirituality. Intercede for the universal Church, so that in these times of confusion and relativism, it may recover the fervor of the first Christians and the apostolic zeal of the holy founders. Pray especially for consecrated souls, that they may live their religious vows with fidelity and become luminous beacons, guiding souls to the safe harbor of eternal salvation. Obtain also for priests the grace to be holy ministers of a holy God, and for the lay faithful the necessary strength to live their Christian vocation amid the difficulties of the contemporary world. Spiritual mother to countless souls, you who knew how to blend maternal tenderness with the firmness needed to guide your daughters along the paths of holiness, extend your maternal protection over us as well, and help us to grow in the theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. When the tribulations of life overwhelm us, and spiritual lukewarmness threatens our fervor, remind us that let nothing disturb you, let nothing frighten you. All things are passing away. God never changes. Patience obtains all things. Whoever has God lacks nothing. God alone suffices. Strengthen our trust in divine providence, and teach us to see in all circumstances of our existence opportunities to grow in love and to collaborate in the redemptive work of Christ. Saint Teresa of the pierced heart, who experienced in your mortal flesh the pains and joys of divine love, obtain for us the grace to respond generously to the infinite love with which God loves us, retaining nothing for ourselves, but giving ourselves totally to His service and to the good of our brothers and sisters. May your example of total surrender and your powerful intercession help us to walk with a firm step towards holiness until we can join you in our heavenly home, to eternally sing the mercies of the Lord. Amen.